In a moment that will likely be remembered for decades, former U.S. President Donald Trump took the stage at the United Nations General Assembly today and delivered what many are calling one of the most defiant, unapologetic, and history-shaping speeches ever given on that platform. The hall was packed, the world's cameras were watching, and from the very first second, Trump's energy was unmistakable. Dressed in a perfectly tailored dark blue suit with his signature red tie, he paused for a few seconds as the room settled into silence, then leaned into the microphone and began to speak with the confidence and cadence that had always defined his public persona. His first words were not the usual diplomatic pleasantries that so many leaders give before the assembly. Instead, he opened with a bold declaration: "America is back, and the world will no longer be the same after today." That line immediately sent ripples across the chamber. Some delegates clapped, some looked shocked, and a few quietly exchanged glances as though they knew this was going to be no ordinary address. Trump wasted no time outlining his view of the current global order, describing it as broken, manipulated by global elites, and desperately in need of reform. He painted a vivid picture of a world where, in his words, nations have been bullied into submission, economies have been siphoned by a handful of corrupt actors, and ordinary people everywhere have been made to pay the price. It was vintage Trump, direct, combative, and delivered with a sense of urgency that made even his critics sit up and listen. Over the next several minutes, he began to dismantle what he called the myth of globalism, arguing that multinational agreements and unelected bureaucrats had weakened sovereign nations and stripped them of their right to decide their own destinies. He pointed to trade deals, military entanglements, and international organizations that, according to him, pretend to serve peace but actually serve the interests of a small group of power brokers. As he spoke, cameras panned across the faces of world leaders, some nodding in agreement, others clearly uncomfortable. Trump's words carried weight not just because of his status as a former president but because they tapped into a growing frustration among many nations who feel left behind by the current system. His language was rich with metaphors and sharp with criticism. He said the United Nations had the potential to be a beacon of cooperation, but had instead turned into a club where the powerful lecture the weak and where promises are made but rarely kept. His voice grew stronger as he called for what he termed a great global reset, not the kind pushed by technocrats, but one led by free nations choosing their own paths. It was a direct challenge to much of the international consensus that has guided diplomacy for decades. Trump then shifted into specifics, laying out a sweeping agenda of what he believed the world should focus on. He demanded that the UN hold corrupt regimes accountable, naming countries and leaders without hesitation, which caused some ambassadors to visibly bristle. He criticized the way international funds had been misused, alleging that billions meant for humanitarian aid had been siphoned by dictators living in palaces while their people starve. He spoke passionately about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right of citizens to resist authoritarian governments. At one point, he raised his voice and said, "If the people of the world cannot speak freely, then none of us are truly free." The chamber erupted in applause, with some delegates even standing in support, a rare sight in such a formal setting. His rhetoric was fiery, but it was also unusually optimistic for Trump. He did not just complain about problems but offered a vision of what could be achieved if nations embraced sovereignty, transparency, and fairness. He painted a picture of a future where wars were ended by strength, not weakness, and where peace was built on respect for borders rather than their erasure. Perhaps the most surprising part of this first section of his speech was how personal he became. Trump spoke about his own journey as a businessman, a president, and now as someone who considers himself a voice for what he called the forgotten men and women not just of America, but of the entire world. He described traveling to rural areas in the United States and hearing stories that reminded him of what he heard from citizens in other countries, parents worried about their children's future, workers who feel abandoned by policymakers, and entire communities devastated by crime, drugs, and war. This humanizing moment changed the mood of the room. The hostility that some leaders might have felt at the beginning gave way to a more reflective atmosphere. Trump seemed to sense this shift, and he softened his tone just slightly, speaking about the shared destiny of humankind. We may be different nations, with different flags, different languages, and different histories, he said, but we all want the same things: safety, dignity, and the right to build a better tomorrow. It was a line that even his harshest critics found difficult to argue with, and it brought a rare moment of unity in a chamber usually defined by division. As the first part of his speech drew to a close, Trump left the world with a challenge rather than a conclusion. He looked around the room slowly, meeting the gaze of several ambassadors, and said, "History is watching what we do here. Our children are watching. The question is not whether we have the power to change the world, we do. The question is whether we have the courage to use it." He then stepped back from the podium, allowing a brief silence to hang in the air before the applause began, scattered at first, then growing into a wave that filled the hall. Whether one loves or hates Donald Trump, it was impossible to deny that his words had shaken the assembly and reframed the conversation about what global leadership should look like. The cameras captured every reaction, and within minutes, social media was on fire, with hashtags related to his speech trending worldwide. Analysts on major news networks were already calling it the most consequential address since Reagan, and speculating about its political and diplomatic impact. The first paragraph of Trump's historic UN appearance was over, but the aftershocks were just beginning, and the world was left waiting for what he would say next. The second portion of Donald Trump's address at the United Nations was even more electrifying than the opening, as he shifted from setting the tone to laying out a radical blueprint for what he believed must change in the world order. After the initial applause subsided, Trump leaned forward and declared, "Enough talk, it is time for action." Those 5 words seemed to jolt the audience awake even more than before. He began by taking aim at the institutions that, in his view, had failed to deliver on their promises. The United Nations was built to stop wars, not to host endless meetings, he said, his voice echoing through the Grand Assembly Hall. Yet we have wars raging in every corner of the globe while diplomats argue about meaningless resolutions. He criticized how peacekeeping missions had too often become bureaucratic exercises rather than effective solutions, and he called for a complete overhaul of how global peacekeeping is funded and executed. He proposed that member nations contribute not just financially but with concrete, measurable commitments, including accountability for when missions fail to protect civilians. This line drew murmurs in the chamber, as many countries have been accused of using the UN as a way to signal support without actually engaging in real action. Trump's speech then pivoted sharply to the topic of economic justice, which he described as the foundation of peace. He accused certain nations of manipulating currency markets, hoarding critical resources, and using international trade agreements to exploit developing economies. "We have created a system," he said, "where the rich countries get richer, the poor countries get poorer, and the middle is disappearing." This wasn't just a criticism of rivals. He acknowledged that even the United States had been guilty of unfair practices in the past, but he insisted that now was the time for a reset. He called for a new era of fair trade agreements based on mutual respect and reciprocity. Arguing that a strong and independent nation is the best partner in trade, not a weak independent one. The moment he said this, several delegates, particularly from African and Southeast Asian nations, nodded in agreement. Trump proposed the creation of what he called a Global Transparency Council, an independent body that would track where international aid money actually goes, publish the data publicly, and name and shame corrupt regimes. The idea drew applause from unexpected corners of the room. Even representatives from countries not known for their alignment with Trump's views seemed intrigued by the concept. The room, however, truly came alive when Trump turned his attention to security and defense. He issued a direct warning to authoritarian regimes who, in his words, believe they can expand their power through intimidation, cyber attacks, or military aggression. Without naming names at first, he made it clear that this was a message to nations like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. "Your time of unchecked expansion is over," he declared, prompting visible tension among the delegations of those countries. He promised that the United States, working alongside allies who value freedom, would not hesitate to respond to threats, whether they came from ballistic missiles, proxy wars, or economic coercion. At one point, Trump even broke from the teleprompter and spoke extemporaneously, saying, "If you think America is weak, think again. We are not only back, we are stronger than ever." The chamber erupted into applause from Western allies, while some adversarial nations remained stone-faced. This moment felt almost cinematic, as cameras caught every reaction, some leaders smirking defiantly, others leaning in as if taking mental notes. But perhaps the most unexpected twist of this section came when Trump addressed the topic of technological freedom. He warned against the dangers of what he called digital tyranny, pointing to the rise of censorship, surveillance, and the manipulation of information by powerful corporations and governments alike. The battle for freedom will not only be fought on land, sea, and air, he said, but in the cloud, on social media, and in every algorithm that shapes what we see and think. He demanded that the United Nations adopt a declaration on digital rights to protect freedom of expression online and prevent governments from silencing dissent. This line brought audible gasps and even some cheers from journalists sitting in the press section, many of whom have faced censorship or persecution in their home countries. Trump's framing of the digital age as the new frontier of human liberty was one of the most widely shared moments on social media just minutes after he spoke. Clips of that line alone were circulating on X, Instagram, and TikTok with captions like, "Trump declares war on internet censorship," and "A digital bill of rights," going viral almost instantly. As he neared the end of the second part of his speech, Trump grew more reflective again, reminding the assembly that change would not come from speeches alone but from decisions made in the days ahead. "Each of you sitting here today represents millions of people who are counting on you," he said, gesturing around the chamber. "Do not let them down. Do not let history remember you as the leaders who watched the world burn while you argued about procedure." The weight of those words hung heavily in the room. Some delegates bowed their heads, others scribbled notes furiously. It was clear that, whether one agreed with Trump's vision or not, he had commanded the attention of every single person in the hall. When he stepped back from the podium this time, the applause was even more thunderous than before, with a significant number of delegates now standing in a gesture of respect. The cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, which bore the unmistakable expression of a man who believed he had just shifted the global conversation in his favor. The world outside the UN headquarters was already reacting, stock markets were fluctuating, political commentators were debating furiously on live television, and world capitals were issuing statements of either support or condemnation. This was no longer just a speech, it was an event, a moment in history that would be dissected for weeks, months, perhaps even years to come. The hours following Donald Trump's address at the United Nations felt less like ordinary diplomatic business and more like the aftermath of an earthquake that had shaken the foundations of global politics. News networks across the world immediately cut into regular programming to broadcast highlights, panel discussions, and instant analysis. CNN labeled the speech Trump's most explosive UN appearance yet, while Fox News hailed it as a triumph for American leadership. BBC called it a challenge to the world order, and Al Jazeera described it as a shot across the bow for global elites. Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags like #TrumpUNSpeech, #GlobalReset, and #DigitalFreedom trended worldwide within minutes. TikTok was flooded with clips of the most fiery lines, set to dramatic music, while X, formerly Twitter, became a battleground of praise and outrage. Supporters hailed the speech as the moment America reclaimed its rightful place as a defender of sovereignty, while critics accused Trump of fanning the flames of nationalism and undermining multilateral cooperation. Diplomatic circles were no less turbulent. Behind closed doors, ambassadors and foreign ministers huddled in urgent meetings to craft official responses. In Washington, the White House, though no longer occupied by Trump, was forced to issue a statement clarifying that the current administration had not coordinated with him, a move that only fueled speculation that Trump was positioning himself for a return to political power. European leaders were divided. Some praised his calls for accountability and fairness, while others feared his rhetoric would embolden populist movements within their own countries. In Moscow, state media first dismissed the speech as political theater, but within hours began airing long segments analyzing his warnings against territorial expansion, suggesting that Kremlin strategists were taking his words seriously. In Beijing, the response was cautious but firm, with Chinese officials accusing Trump of spreading division and undermining the spirit of cooperation. Still, analysts noted that China's stock markets opened lower the next day, reflecting investor uncertainty about the future of trade relations. On the streets of several major cities, the public reaction took on a life of its own. In New York, just outside the UN building, crowds gathered holding signs that read, "Thank you Trump," and "Sovereignty First," while counter-protesters held placards denouncing nationalism and warning against a return to Cold War-style politics. In Paris, London, and Berlin, student groups organized watch parties where they debated the implications of what they had just heard. Some praised Trump for speaking bluntly about corruption and bureaucracy, while others argued that his speech threatened decades of diplomatic progress. In nations struggling under authoritarian rule, however, the speech was received almost like a manifesto of liberation. Videos circulated of citizens in Venezuela, Iran, and Myanmar sharing clips of Trump's line about the right to resist tyranny, with captions like, "This is what we needed to hear." Dissident groups reportedly used the speech as a rallying cry, calling on the international community to finally take their plight seriously. Mainstream media coverage was intense, but what made this moment particularly powerful was the grassroots reaction. Ordinary people flooded social media with commentary, some saying they felt inspired for the first time in years by a world leader speaking so directly about freedom and sovereignty. Others worried that his uncompromising tone could lead to more conflict, not less. Polling agencies scrambled to release overnight surveys, and the results were staggering. Approval of Trump's message spiked not just among conservatives but even among independents and some moderate liberals who said they appreciated his boldness and honesty. By contrast, global elites were in damage control mode, with think tanks and NGOs rushing to publish op-eds warning that Trump's speech could fracture international alliances and destabilize global governance systems. The New York Times called it a manifesto for unilateralism, while the Wall Street Journal countered by calling it the most visionary speech given at the UN in decades. The diplomatic fallout intensified when several nations announced they were reconsidering their participation in certain UN-led initiatives, citing Trump's call for accountability. A handful of African nations formally requested audits of aid distribution, aligning with Trump's demand for transparency. Meanwhile, countries heavily dependent on foreign aid expressed concern that funding might be withheld until such audits were completed. This triggered heated debates within the UN corridors, with some diplomats accusing Trump of weaponizing transparency to pressure governments, while others argued that this was exactly the reform the UN had needed for years. Even the Secretary General was reportedly forced to convene an emergency session with senior officials to address what he called a potential rebalancing of global governance. Meanwhile, media personalities, celebrities, and influencers began weighing in, turning the speech into a pop culture moment. High-profile commentators like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson praised the courage of calling out global corruption on a world stage, while late-night hosts joked about how Trump had probably just launched his unofficial 2028 campaign. Elon Musk even tweeted a cryptic message, "Sovereignty or globalism," which sent his post viral and sparked heated debate about the role of tech moguls in shaping public opinion. Musicians, actors, and YouTubers began remixing sound bites from the speech into songs, memes, and short clips, making it reach audiences far beyond traditional political circles. What had started as a formal diplomatic address had turned into a cultural phenomenon, one that was now influencing everything from financial markets to college campus debates. Perhaps the most telling sign of the speech's impact came from the United Nations itself. For the first time in years, the normally quiet delegates' lounge was buzzing with animated conversations long after the day's session had ended. Diplomats who normally avoided Trump's rhetoric admitted privately that his speech had hit a nerve. Some said they were worried about the precedent it set, that former heads of state could bypass normal channels and command global attention, while others quietly suggested that perhaps Trump had voiced what many had been thinking but were too afraid to say. By the end of the day, it was clear that Trump had not just delivered a speech but had ignited a debate that was far from over. The world was now locked in a conversation about sovereignty, accountability, and freedom, and whether this moment would lead to meaningful reform or to deeper divisions remained an open question. As the dust settled from Trump's historic address, one truth became undeniable: the world had been forced to listen, and nothing would return to the quiet status quo. In the days that followed, governments scrambled to recalibrate their foreign policies, markets shifted in response to renewed uncertainty, and activists found a fresh wave of energy to demand accountability from their leaders. Trump himself remained characteristically confident, issuing a brief statement declaring that, "This is only the beginning." Whether one viewed him as a disruptor or a visionary, his words had ignited a conversation that could no longer be ignored. The UN General Assembly, often criticized for being ceremonial and slow-moving, now stood at a crossroads, either rise to the challenge of reform or risk becoming irrelevant in a world demanding action. The speech's legacy was clear. It reminded nations that power still belongs to the people, and that true leadership is not about appeasing the comfortable but challenging the status quo. As Trump left New York, cameras captured him giving a final wave, a symbolic gesture that seemed to say he was not finished yet. History, it seemed, had just been given a new chapter, and the world was watching.